images caught the imagination of the entire world. The triumph of the Sandinista Revolution on July 19, 1979 was celebrated with euphoria in Nicaragua and applauded far and wide. It marked the end of one of the region's most corrupt and brutal dictatorships and the beginning of a promise of freedom and democracy in an impoverished and war-torn country.
It was the culmination of a long struggle, a victory for our country's independence, sovereignty and self-determination.
But in Washington, the victory of the young pro-Cuban Sandinistas was seen as a threat, one the United States would go to extraordinary lengths to crush.
To do nothing in Central America is to give the first communist stronghold on the North American continent a green light to spread its poison throughout this free and increasingly democratic country.
30 years on, and the revolution is just a distant memory. Nicaragua is once again ruled by the Sandinistas, and Daniel Ortega is once again the president. But this version of the Sandinistas is one that many of the original revolutionaries would not recognize. I covered the Sandinista Revolution. Now, 3 decades on, I've returned to see how that revolution changed Nicaragua. American interests in Nicaragua go far back, long before the 1980s Reagan era. Since the 1800s, the United States had been calling the shots, invading Nicaragua no less than 8 times, overthrowing and installing successive governments. And their interests extended to their control of land and agricultural production, meaning that the rural poor were essentially tenants on their own land. But this overwhelming U.S. influence helped create a Nicaraguan rebel legend. Augusto Cesar Sandino would lead the first armed nationalist movement in Latin America to drive American military forces from the region. Sandino's name would later be taken by the Sandinistas, who claimed to be representing his principles.
I identify myself with Sandino because the thinking on Sandino was very simple for me. It was based in 3 bases. Sovereignty, independence of Nicaraguan sovereignty, democracy and social progress, social justice.
Sandino's image is still everywhere. It stands as a symbol of Nicaragua's struggle for freedom from abuse of power and from foreign domination. Yet he was to meet his end at the hands of the American-backed Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the first leader of a family dictatorship that was to endure for 43 years. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said of him, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch."
Nicaragua is a beautiful town.
He used his power to accumulate enormous personal wealth at the expense of the peasantry, a family business that was continued by the 2 sons. But it was his second son, General Anastasio Somoza Debayle, whose regime became infamous for its intolerance of dissent. As the Sandinista rebellion grew, so too did the violent response. The Masaya volcano, some 20 kilometers south of the capital, Managua, has a particularly gruesome past. During the Somoza dictatorship, the National Guard would sometimes throw political opponents into the mouth of this volcano. Such was the brutality of the regime that the resistance movement soon gained widespread support, not just at home, but also abroad. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, was a broad-based coalition of students, intellectuals, and farm workers, led by a committee of 9 military commanders, or comandantes. Among them was Daniel Ortega, who would eventually become the first amongst equals.
El pueblo quiere revolución.
But the face that the world would first come to know was that of Eden Pastora, a bold and charismatic rebel commander with a knack for having his picture taken.
¿Querés que te enseñe una foto inédita?
Do you want me to show you a photo that's never been published? That's Daniel and me when we went to Cuba in 1976 to sell Fidel our project.
76, 77.
Oh my God. That project would gain worldwide attention 2 years later when Pastora led a spectacular assault on the National Palace. Nearly 1,000 hostages were taken. He obtained in exchange the release of 59 political prisoners and safe passage to Panama for those involved in the attack. As Pastora climbed the stairs of the plane, he, unlike the rest of his comrades, removed his mask. A calculated move to make his the face of the Sandinista attack. To this day, he has no regrets.
No nos quedó otro camino.
We had no other choice but to take up arms. The politicians had exhausted all other civic options. My father was assassinated by the Somozas when I was 8 years old, and so I grew up seeking justice, until I finally took a rifle in my hand and implemented justice on my own.
With support of sympathetic governments from Cuba to neighboring Costa Rica, the Sandinista rebellion grew, pitting the Somoza regime against the people. But Somoza remained defiant, insisting that he, not the Sandinistas, had their support.
They're not becoming stronger. If they were becoming stronger, we would have public demonstrations here. If they had the support of the people, I wouldn't be here.
By January 1979, the rebellion had developed into an all-out conflict. Over the next 7 months, more than 30,000 people would die. Washington was mistrustful of the Sandinistas and was reluctant to withdraw support for Somoza. But it looked on with increasing unease at Somoza's blatant disregard for human rights.
From the time in which the elder Somoza took power to the moment in which the younger Somoza, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, was overthrown by the Sandinistas in July of 1979. During that period of time, U.S. policy to Nicaragua was complex. By and large, the U.S. supported Somoza, but there were many moments in which the United States was opposed to his regime and tried to encourage him to either step aside or permit free elections, but to no avail.
In June 1979, these images of American television correspondent Bill Stewart being executed by the National Guard reached American living rooms. With these images, any lingering U.S. support for the Somoza regime came to an end. Deprived of American support, Somoza and many of his senior officers fled the country. On July 19, 1979, the nation celebrated the Sandinista Revolution. Mónica Baltodano was one of the resistance top military commanders in Managua.
Our dream was not just to remove Somoza as a dictator, but also to initiate a new phase that would resolve the extreme poverty in our country. We wanted access to education, to land, and to material benefits from which the majority of Nicaraguans were and continue to be excluded.
A government of national reconstruction was formed, with moderates from the business community, intellectuals, conservative political parties, and Marxists. It was an unprecedented revolutionary experiment in the region. The Sandinistas promised political pluralism, a mixed economy, and non-alignment. But within months, these high ideals would be put to the test. as old tensions with the U.S. re-emerged. With the political revolution complete, the Sandinistas wasted no time in embarking upon a social revolution. They launched a widely applauded campaign that reduced illiteracy from 60% to just 13%. Education and healthcare were made available to those who'd never had them. And an ambitious land redistribution program was launched. For the first time, those who had toiled on the land their whole lives had a chance to own it. But by the end of the first year, the Sandinista leadership's socialist ideals had begun to alienate moderates who were uncomfortable with the anti-American rhetoric and growing ties to communist Cuba.
I think because it was more an ideological revolution than a political revolution. I think to be ideological is very dangerous, and to be young, because we were very young.
Washington saw red. With guerrilla wars erupting in other parts of Central America, the Reagan administration decided that the Sandinista experiment had to end.
I think that they are very concerned that if little Nicaragua could stand up and defend its rights under international law to decide its own destiny, then other countries would see that bad example.
But it was not just the Sandinistas' domestic policies that concerned Washington. It was their active cooperation with Marxist rebels in nearby El Salvador.
The Reagan administration was unlikely to ever have a normal relationship with the Sandinistas. But for the Reagan administration to go to the point of making war against Nicaragua required an act like their support for the FMLN in El Salvador. So there is no question that they were supporting the Salvadorans before the Reagan administration started the Contras.
And so, once again, the United States intervened in Nicaragua. In late 1981, the CIA launched both overt and covert operations to finance a counter-revolutionary army with remnants of Somoza's National Guard, better known as the Contras. Less than 2 years after Somoza's overthrow, Nicaragua's period of peace was over. With their ragtag army and outdated weaponry, the Sandinistas were ill-equipped to confront the U.S.-financed counter-revolutionaries. They turned to the obvious place for help, to Washington's biggest adversary, the Soviet Union.
We didn't want to take part in the Cold War. We believed in non-alignment and non-involvement in the East-West conflict. But in the end, when the revolution was being besieged and strangled, and above all suffering militarily from the aggression, we went to Soviet bloc countries for weapons.
We needed weapons, arms, and helicopters and planes. Under pressure of the United States, no one would give us anything. So we need something to defend ourselves. And it isn't that we're accepting, we asked to buy those weapons because we needed. And if the United States prevented everyone else in the West to sell us weapons, what are we going to do? Allow our country to be overrun? No, no.
Nicaragua was once again a battleground. The right-wing Contra army was spreading quickly through the remote northern mountain region. American photojournalist Bill Gentile covered both sides of the conflict from the onset.
The war in Nicaragua really was very, very much like the war in Vietnam, in the sense that it was a series of profoundly boring, long, agonizing walks in a very, very uncomfortable environment, the tropical highlands up in the mountains of Nicaragua. And this boredom was broken by these unscheduled, unanticipated explosions of gunfire and weaponry and men bleeding and dying. And it was a series of these long walks through the mountains and sometimes completely chance encounters. My time with the Sandinistas was much more enlightening, if you will. And my time with the Contras was much more tense because of the level of suspicion and distrust on their part. And because we knew that they were doing bad things. I mean, we knew that they were coming in from Honduras, from these camps where Americans were training them. And we knew that they were assassinating political leaders, peasant leaders in Nicaragua. We knew that they were, consistent and profound violators of human rights. Not that the Sandinistas were angels, they weren't. But they didn't do the things that the Contras did.
The Sandinistas responded by expropriating the land of suspected Contra collaborators, turning conservative peasants in the countryside against them. And then they began to limit civil liberties.
Es cierto, hubo una guerra de agresión. There was a war of aggression. There were restrictions, there was a state of emergency, there was a restriction to freedom of the press and censorship.
Administré la autocensura.
The Sandinistas justified the media censorship and the state of emergency, arguing it was a necessary evil of the war. Convinced that the revolution he had fought for had sold out to Cuban and Soviet communism, Sandinista war hero Eden Pastora changed sides and founded his own independent resistance group in southern Nicaragua to fight the Sandinistas.
They were endangering the most beautiful revolution in the world.
Hoping to counter growing international criticism and internal opposition, the Sandinistas held elections in 1984 as promised. Daniel Ortega, until then the coordinator of the 9-man Sandinista Directorate, was elected president. Unable to stem the advance of the Contras, the Sandinistas implemented would prove to be a key strategic mistake: conscription.
We began to manage power with arrogance and with the belief that only what we thought and did was the right thing. That began to distance us from the people, and not just that, it began dividing our society.
As the conflict became even more bloody, the Sandinistas adopted some of their enemies' tactics, as thousands of boy soldiers were conscripted, often at gunpoint. At a stroke, the ideal of freedom enshrined in the revolution was lost. 68-year-old cattle farmer Rodolfo Castillo had never liked the Sandinistas, but tolerated them, until his eldest son, who was not yet 18, was taken from school by the army and sent to the front lines.
The Contras got him in mid-battle. He had no training. His friends that were with him say he was so nervous that he stood up. And when he did, the bullet hit him right here, and it came out through there.
No part of Nicaraguan society was left untouched by the war, including the hugely influential Catholic Church, whose leaders threw their weight behind the Contras. The staunchly conservative Obando y Bravo, the Archbishop of Managua, used the pulpit to denounce the Sandinistas, with Washington's blessing. Not content with fueling the Civil War, in May 1985, the Reagan administration imposed an economic embargo. Even though Nicaragua is a country rich in natural resources, the embargo had a devastating effect. Nicaraguans had always boasted of their mountains, their lakes, and their enormous volcanoes. It's a country of lush, fertile soil where almost anything grows, from corn, bananas, and coffee to tobacco, a key export crop. But when the United States declared economic sanctions against the Sandinistas, everything from fuel to fertilizers began to disappear. Without petrol or spare parts for their vehicles, farmers could not transport their goods to market. And export crops, like tobacco, were also hard hit.
The Sandinistas gave us this tobacco cooperative to 30 families in the early 80s, so that we could be the owners of the land that we work.
But back then, most of the tobacco ended up never leaving the country because the United States had closed the door to Nicaraguan imports. The acute scarcities provoked by the war and sanctions forced people to take desperate measures. These iguanas are supposed to be the magic cure for anemia, diabetes, and asthma. In fact, people here in Nicaragua swear by them. And I remember that back in the 80s, hordes of people used to line up here trying to buy their iguanas because they had no other choice. It was almost impossible to find ordinary medicine. Today, Managua's main market is well stocked, and iguana soup is considered to be a delicacy. A far cry from the days of austerity, as economic turmoil further fueled discontent. By 1986, the Sandinista Revolution was in disarray. Contras were also in trouble. With reports of their human rights violations mounting, the U.S. Congress banned the government from providing funds for the rebels, setting the stage for the biggest scandal of the Reagan administration, the Iran-Contra affair. Determined to continue their funding of the Contras, U.S. officials sold arms to Iran in exchange for the release of U.S. hostages and millions of dollars. This cash, in turn, was funneled to the 23,000-strong Contra Army. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the U.S. National Security Council, played a key role in establishing the covert network.
And I don't like the insinuation that I'm up here having a convenient memory lapse like perhaps some others have had.
I think that Oliver North was a true zealot. He was a true believer. He thought they were in an historic apocalyptic struggle against the communist world, and they had to fight to the death in Nicaragua. And these Democrats on Capitol Hill were all weak-kneed and soft on communism. And so he had to save the United States all by himself.
I'm going to save any comments till the whole hearing is.
President Reagan survived the scandal, claiming memory loss.
I'm having some trouble remembering that. We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
But the episode sounded the death knell for the Contras. And the decade of strife had also taken its toll on the Sandinistas. The Nicaraguan people were exhausted from war, economic turmoil, and confrontation with each other and the United States. It was against this backdrop that Ortega made good on his promise to compete in free elections. He was voted out in favor of a broad alliance led by Violeta Chamorro.
So the results of that election were unexpected. We wanted to win, we expected to win, and it was very hard to assimilate the results and for them to really sink in. But we didn't think twice about accepting the results.
Gracious in defeat, the Sandinistas had proven even their fiercest critics wrong.
The day which the Sandinist front recognized that we have lost the elections and that Mrs. Chamorro had won the election, it was a great day for democracy in Nicaragua.
It had been 10 years since the Sandinista Revolution, but as Daniel Ortega acknowledged defeat in the Plaza of the Revolution,